It's a real pleasure to introduce to you Ovul Durmusoglu, who's a curator and writer based in Berlin, Istanbul, and Graz. After her guest professorship for curatorial theory and praxis in Nuremberg Fine Arts Academy, she currently is one of the curators of the Streichischer Herbst Festival in Graz, which will take place this September. In Istanbul, Ovul has acted as the director and curator of Yama Screen between 2015 and 16. She was curatorial and public program advisor for Gulsun Kara Mustafa's retrospective in the Chronographia at the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum for Gegenwart, and she's going to discuss these two projects with us today. She's also organized coordinated programs and events as a Goethe Institute Fellow at Maybe Education and Public Programs for Documenta 13, and has been the Artistic Director of Festival Sofia Contemporary 2013, Near Closer Together, Exercises for a Common Ground. This is also a project that Ovul will discuss with us today. So as you see, we're sort of moving through a range of formats that Ovul has been part of. And one of the things that's been very unique about her approach is the way that she blends in exhibition making and programming, and really has been building communities across various cities and contexts. So look forward to this. Thank you, Ovul.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. I mean, this is such a pleasure to be in front of such an invigorating, challenging audience, and part of also amazing practitioners who also inspire me with their thoughts and acts. Of course, this travel will be a different travel. So, I mean, I will take you to a different universe of my universe. It's a universe of 10,000 things, and it moves through continents and cities. How do I do this? What? Does it work? One. I am the other way around. Okay. Well, yeah. That's a good starting point. So I will open my talk with more like a kind of a positioning, and then afterwards I will connect some projects that I did over the last, let's say, 3-4 years' time, like to this positioning. And of course, for this position, I want to start from like the kind of, let's say, the basics, the fundamentals for me. The Sphinx was destroyed when Oedipus answered her riddle correctly as human. And right now, I feel it is the time, maybe referring to the Shanghai Biennial, to inquire about the questions, since the answers we have cannot respond the unified feeling of discontent around the world and its anti-intellectualism that is offered as a solution to this discontent. What is the answer? Then what is the question? This is a famous quote by Gertrude Stein, and she asked this question to her partner, Alice B. Toklas. As a follow-up, in a different context, in the very elaborate Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih, the Sudanese author, he is in the book more interested in the questions of colonialism rather than easy answers. The dualities he structured his novel, which I would certainly recommend for anyone, I think it's a kind of a very fundamental reading, challenges the dichotomy between self and the other. And for him, one is not so much different from the other. His two main characters travel between north and south, east and west. They speak Arabic and English. The four-headed Sphinx that you see here is part of the very famous collection of Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. And it is dated 2000, I think 2 AD. Yeah, it's in the second half of 2nd century. It's made of marble. It belongs to the collection of antiquities. For me, this is such a symbolic image for my thinking, but also the way we are struggling with our subjectivities today. Because the foreheads of the Sphinx already shattered the most well-known Cartesian mind and body collection and challenged the dichotomy machine of like Western epistemology. It also reminds me of the saying by Maya Angelou in the beginning of talk. She always like thinks about all the women behind her, and then she is like an army of women when she's speaking in front. So for me, like when I have the Sphinx, four-headed Sphinx behind me, I feel like I am also with an army of women. Let's see. So let's pass to another context. I mean, it's not so far. This is Anatolia. It is the Neolithic times. It is another famous like idol figure of two goddesses embracing each other in the same body from the central Anatolia, Çatalhöyük. And as you see here, like the two bodies, like they come together in one, two minds or two subjectivities come together in one body in reciprocity, but they also embrace each other, they touch each other. So there is certainly a different boundary, or maybe no boundary, between mind and body here as represented. Another example, again, from Anatolia. And this is, again, Central Anatolian, like very antique. I think this is even before, this is the Paleolithic. And again, like a kind of a goddess figure we see. At this time, they are part of the same base. And they are like these two bodies, like appearing out of the same base. So as we see, there are no borders, no individual spaces, no customized choices. And my connection to today is, let's say, also to the art practice and thinking that I come from in Turkey, is Double Reality by Gülsün Kara Mustafa. This is a particular image from cross-generational exhibitions that happened in Istanbul in the late 2000s and in the late 90s and early 2000s. And Gülsün found this male mannequin on the street wearing a maternity dress. And she decided to bring that whole body, whole ready-made, into the space of the exhibition. And of course, as you can imagine, designing, let's say, the conflicting squares around, like conflicting space around. Let's stay here. So from this position, I'd like to think a little bit about our beloved Édouard Glissant, because he rightfully points out that from the perspective of the Western thought, understanding people and ideas requires being measured with transparency. He says, in order to understand and thus accept you, I have to measure your solidity with ideal scale, providing me with grounds to make comparisons and perhaps judgments. I have to reduce. But as we all know, when there is reduction, there is no relation. And today, when the codes of our lives perform control and transparency all the way through, we need to answer that transparency through thinking opaque. And of course, there are various readings of opacity. Certainly, it's not obscurity, it's something else. It can be understood as an incalculable alterity that is at once the relational ontology of the world, an ethical demand, certainly, a form of political legitimation, and a poetics. To paraphrase Glissant again, he says, some truths manifestations come to us intuitively, like a sparkle of light in the dark. They mustn't be isolated from the darkness and opacity out of which they emerge. So therefore, against this environment of deranged reduction that we are all experiencing, we must not surrender to the partitioning of the world, nor to irreconcilable differences, to binary oppositions, to oppositions of species and genres and gender and else and else. So, when I speak to this part, I will still continue to position, but I want to accompany you with the very important initiation, I wouldn't say a project, but initiation of Istanbul-based artist Banu Cennetoglu, The List, because she is talking about that reduction and the information of that reduction. So, of course, when we are thinking of this reduction, the borderless dream, as we understand of the post-89, maybe we understood it more like with all these elections that happened in 2016, it seems to be a reductive one in the first place. So it wasn't really what it says it was. And with the resurgence of the right-wing populisms across the world, I know that here you are suffering from one, in my country I'm suffering from one. They are all the same faces. They are part of, they are these multi-headed monsters. They are part of the same body. The globalism right now has turned from friend to foe. However, whether these politicians would like to accept or not, there always have been many unexpected violent and non-violent affinities across the different strata of nature, the communities, and cultures resisting the one-sided ideological readings. And from our side, I think, whether we like it or not, it is impossible to ignore the fact that the process of subsuming our political and social subjectivities under micro and macro control models have brought us to our current deranged predicament. And when we look at the embracing bodies of the Neolithic age, when we look at the four-headed sphinx of the Roman times, we see a different past and a different way of thinking. So, for me, in my work, the future cannot look elsewhere without acknowledging and accepting what it was we did in the first place. What happened when we abandoned those habits and started building new ones? Because obviously, we live in a world of 10,000 things. And the linear thinking of reduced Western subjectivity cannot access and fathom and go beyond that. So therefore, of course, here, the question is grasping the personal fundament that will immediately connect with a collective fundament. So that's why I use the word resilience, curating as a form of resilience. Because for me, there is honestly nothing else to do. And I use this word because I refuse this straightforward divisions between art and activism, art and politics, political art, aesthetic art. It is beyond that. It is a model we need that needs to embrace all of these dichotomies, like killing and collapsing the dichotomy machine rather than surrendering to it. In Merriam-Webster dictionary, if we go back to basic again, the word resilience is described as a derivation from the Latin verb resilire, meaning to jump back, to recoil, and the word itself is based on salire, which means to leap. So it already, carries this conflict inside itself. That is a jump back and leap at the same time. But of course, resilience is a term that is regularly used In physics, it's the ability of the elastic material to absorb energy and respond back. And also this phenomenon stands for a person's ability to bounce after a setback. And for me, of course, clearly resilience is, yeah? What? Oh, images. Oh, yeah. Yes, we have a lot of images, you're right. So resilience is a major component of constructive hope. And today, experimenting with, in my work with various models, experimenting with institutions and like independent work, expressing a world vision in various forms, as I'm also trying to do here right now, claiming for a political voice that doesn't repeat the status quo, or that doesn't yearn for moral provocation, for a rigorous poetics that attempts to relate to its context and its audience. Yes, curating is a form of resilience. Here you see a project that I was engaged with, Yama Public Screen. It is the first public screen of Istanbul. It doesn't function anymore, unfortunately. After the coup attempt of 2016, it's impossible to do anything actually in public space freely anymore. And I was very honored to do some of the last projects that I actually commissioned for the screen. This collaboration with Banu Cennetoglu, the list is an actual list of people who lost their lives crossing the borders of the Fortress Europe since 1993. So despite this crisis, as refugee crisis, with all of this, let's say, politically correct vocabulary that's used in the Western press, it started long before actually with the Yugoslavian war. And Banu has been working with this list for quite a long time. She also did this project in various places, also in Basel, and right now in Liverpool. And this was like an iteration back again in 2015. It was the time of the Istanbul Biennial, and actually it was the time of this famous sad image that also Ai Weiwei provoked of this kid on the Aegean coastline. And this was a particular video piece that no information was repeated one more time. And it was all the known facts of people, where they come from, the region they crossed, and why they died, reported, of course, with all the efforts of the volunteering humanitarian agency. Of course, through initiating, let's say, through initiating this information in the visibility of her artistic space, Banu questions the nature of the information and how does it make us feel, and how can we actually relate with that, and what does it mean to show this information, to make this information more and more visible in the public space. So the second, I have to say, while we had Banu's work, there were already some people asking about what it was to the reception. As you see, this is a very central location of Istanbul, and this screen can be seen from anywhere else, close by. And we suspected, of course, it was a sort of intelligence of police, asking what this was all about. And this second commission workers forum with Pilvi Takala, a Berlin and Helsinki-based artist, was talking about the prosthetic labor in our world today. She worked as a part of an online dating app, and then afterwards she created, she initiated a workers forum where these workers behind this online boyfriend-girlfriend app, the problems that they kind of came across. So it is, of course, a very well critique of the labor functions today and how machines still need the human intelligence and emotionality to continue their operation. And so the Workers' Forum actually was also the project where we had a conversation with Pilvi and Istanbul, now Hong Kong-based curator Özge Ersoy, that we experienced the presence of the first police, secret police, like coming to watch the event and what it was about. So I never actually experienced this in Istanbul before. So this was something very particular for me. And unfortunately, with the third project that we initiated, the screen started to receive invisible threats, like from people calling the hotel, and the municipality said that they cannot let the screen anymore. So I would say like these images are like the last images of the Yama public screen in Istanbul. The PC, the very site-specific PC that operated it, is deconstructed by the municipal and hotel authorities not to cause any more conflicts in the public space.
But what images were on the screen? What was the screen projecting?
The screen is projecting this video projects that's kind of commissioned. With Banus, it was all this video of the information that lasted, let's say, video that lasted like 1 month and 10 days, and it was never repeating itself, and it was flowing. And with Pilvi's work, it was a projection of this kind of online chat conversation between the workers talking about their problems as like the online laborers of part-time space, and actually like the relationality, you know, how humans relate to each other with all this, of course, question of like the private relationship expanded to this kind of fake space. Yes, it was legible. It was legible. Of course, like it was very particular. Of course, the technologies that Pilvi speaks about, this was a very interesting contrast with this particular project, because the technologies that Pilvi is speaking about is well beyond the technology when the screen was installed. It was first of its kind. It was even before the LED screens. So it's a very particular technology that doesn't really exist anymore. It came from Australia all the way, and it was installed on the top of a hotel with the initiation of the family. One of the members of the family is a very good art patron, and he was very supporting this project from the very beginning.
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Wow. That's what happens when come after a long discussion. Okay, so then I hope maybe I would really like to speak about this project, which is a very dear project of me, for me. And this is an image from Canan, Nihayet içimdesin means you're finally inside of me. And this exhibition that happened in 2015 and 16 is the 20th year anniversary of Kaos GL, which is the first LGBTI NGO in Turkey that is still like very forcefully continuing its activities despite all the restrictions coming from various, you know, publics and like state. And the exhibition that I titled as Future Queer, but of course there's a reason that I titled as Future Queer. And I know that I have a short of time, but I still want to go through another important quote that I want to share with you in the space of this thought. This is from another really very, I think, important reference for the queer thought by Jose Munoz, is Cruising Utopias. And he says, "We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality, to be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present." So inspired from this thought, the exhibition was titled Future Queer, a queerness that is yet to come, a queerness that's not really belonging directly to, you know, a sexual orientation, but to a state of mind, to an aesthetics that can break the quagmire of the present. And of course, it was a big load for me. I mean, 20th year of a movement is a painful movement, but it's also a very brave movement. And it was a very big responsibility to take this challenge, try to go through what to do. So Kaos GL has a magazine that used to be a very important platform for people to communicate through. when there was no internet and no apps and chats. And they also published important artist portfolios, very young at the time, that supported Kaos GL magazine through their statements. And in this show, we decided to bring together like the artists who contributed to the magazine and selected works of them to become part of this space. Of course, this was very important. Like this happened in a house, in a villa space. And this was a very important statement for me because all the public movements always start from this kind of private, intimate gatherings, and then this kind of force comes out to outside, to public, to join the public discourse. And there was, as you can imagine, there's a huge archive of Kaos GL, which I really tried like to erase boundaries with the exhibition. So there's in various moments in this publicness, in this tension between public and private, which is something very delicate in Turkey. There were like these iterations of like the archival moments that the artists were responding. So it was a kind of moving back and forth, which was very important for me to state. Here is like, for example, an installation of Nilbar Güreş, an Istanbul and Vienna-based artist, like who's really working a lot. Maybe one of the first artists openly working with queer politics in a sense. But of course, it was also about like creating the house space, like a breathing space reminding us like what actually these movements achieved in Turkey in the time of, let's say, the darkness, when everybody's feeling a little bit hopeless and not knowing where to go. And this was a kind of environment that I tried to create, like, of course, through the generous support of the artists. So you really see a kind of a particular setting in the house. Also moving in between some like works from the international context to support our statement. So for me, for example, this image of Berlin-based artist Susan Winterling is a very important image for me that stands for like that opaque togetherness. That's very powerful. Again, maybe it's also important to say in the fact that this movement in Turkey, maybe all movements should. It was never standing for like a sole cause of like the sexual orientation. It was always about anti-fascism, anti-militarism, anti-homophobia, and anti-transphobia, like all together at the same time. So the position of the queer is a position of the togetherness, in a political, radical political togetherness in that sense, that really tries to reach all of these channels. And the magazine is quite big now, but you can really see like the early versions of it, which was kind of copy and Xerox base. And the school that we did inside like the exhibition space, and inviting the queer activists, because of course the activist space and the contemporary art space, they are two really different spaces, try to bring all these kind of, let's say, forces together and make them discuss. So actually, the exhibition, I mean, this was the biggest opening I ever experienced in my life. It was such an embrace from the public. We had an amazing variety, a myriad of audience coming from different backgrounds, really like visiting and discussing with us. Should I continue with Gülsün? What do you think? Like, because do we? Okay. And then we have to stop. Okay. So something that is kind of quite connected. I mean, in the exhibition of the Future Queer, for example, there were artists that were marked in the map, and there were artists who contributed as sort of like the environment of the past house, that kind of house environment, and Gülsün Kara Mustafa was one of them. And Gülsün is one of the, I don't know if you know her work, but she is one of landmarks of contemporary art in Turkey. She's been practicing various forms of art since the last 45, 50 years. And And for me, she's always like, she is the queer thinker. She never, of course, identifies as such, and she never says as such, but it is so inherent in the work. And I was very, of course, honored to be able to work with her closely for her major retrospective in Berlin. It was the first time that she made such a big show in Europe. And this is like, actually, the kind of, this image, this work that you can remember, like it's one of the first works that I showed in the beginning of my presentation. And this installation shows a little bit of her like textile work, but again, how she uses the ready-made, like the popular, that what is popular, but trying to really understanding kitsch as a public force, as a critical voice that can be embraced, which is always very present in her work. And of course, as you can also understand, there's always the mythology of women that she deals with. And here I always find it very like beautiful that all of the women are on equal, let's say, positions, like there is no higher and lower. So all these mythologies for her is like the equally accessible mythologies that should be deconstructed and reconstructed again. And this is a quite different project. It's an educational structure that she referred to. Actually, this is something very dear for me because my grandparents are educated in this structure called Village Institutes. It unfortunately closed in the first 10 years of the New Republic. The pictures that you're seeing is the archival photos of the Village Institute that wanted the village kids to be the educators of themselves. So these institutions created this one-to-one, really special pedagogical model that created an important generation of intellectuals that dealt with folk culture and realism and the countryside. In Turkey, my grandparents also spent all their lives teaching school children in villages across West Anatolia. Gülsün wanted to kind of work with the structure because the structure itself was created by famous anti-fascist architect Margaret Schütte-Lihotzky, who actually is a kind of a less-known story that escaped to Turkey in the time of, the challenges. And she provided some models, some drawings for different projects. I mean, they had to be of use to be able to stay in Turkey. And the Village Institute model was something that she provided. And it was never directly used, but again, like it was there always, like as a model of construction. And referring to this, let's say, unbinding of dichotomies, what Turkish culture stands for in Germany, she created this model and called Modernity Unveiled, because it's very much about how modernity is performed in Turkey and its complex roots. Maybe I should stop here. I think it's time. I mean, I have more images, of course, as you can imagine, but we can always discuss them through. And I think this is a kind of a good point to end with this ongoing project of Objects of Desire, which is considered, again, like an important project of, let's say, the post-89 space in Europe, because Istanbul was one of the important ports, and there was a huge flux of people and huge modes of exchange. People were coming with their goods to sell, and they were buying things. Turkey was the closest, let's say, liberal capitalist port that people access things from the Soviet Russia and other nations. This was maybe the first moment that Istanbul was so international after Ottoman time. And Gülsün created these objects for sale that one can bid up until 100 euros. And all these objects actually she collected from the shops that was founded for these consumers in Istanbul, and that can be bought, and that the money was always going back to these women, supporting these women, because they were really laboring, sexual laboring, but also cleaning labor, a lot of domestic labor that they went through. It's a kind of it was a huge invisible economy in Istanbul and generally in Turkey at that point. And of course, the project doesn't really function anymore. You cannot really buy but you can really see the objects that she always adds on top. And then here is like the kind of documentations of the objects that have been sold in time in the life of the project. So it's a very alive, like still living installation and still referring to our times of like thinking migration and all the invisible economies that come with it. So I have more to say, of course, as you can imagine, but I need to stop now when I'm expecting your questions to go further. Thank you for your patience.
Perhaps I can start. It would be great to also draw a link between an exhibition such as Future Queer, but also then this sort of way in which queerness and opacity are interlinked and sort of intrinsically connected across various kinds of exhibitions that you have done.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering how that sort of, at this sensitive question of what this sort of pluralistic ways of being are cited within public space, even today, right? I mean, your project in Sofia, the festival in Sofia, how do you sort of continue working in Turkey after the closing down of the Yama screen? I mean, maybe you could take up some examples of that in your work.
Of course, just to give as an image, what was the follow-up? Thank you. I mean, this is, of course, an important question in my work, because something, of course, that I wanted to refer to in my positioning was about like the immune systems that we need to build today for ourselves. And I mean, for me, honestly, the position of the opacity and how it embraces certain personal positions without falling into the trap, in the way identity politics is used by the right-wing populisms today in various ways. For me, opacity is a very constructive, let's say, stone for that systems of immunity. And of course, I always tend to go back into a kind of more fundamental histories rather than looking at the histories of progress, because progress, but there's a certain point where we lose our level of contamination. And I think this liberal thought that we are all engaged with, and we all contributed to in one way or the other in our work, really this political correctness killed our immune systems in a very particular way. And thinking, and then this is also our performance of transparency in our everyday, through different means. Again, also through our projects. I'm talking as a curator right now, as ours. So, so for me, the future queer was building an immunity system, reminding the community that what happened and what can happen more, and what is actually, what certain things that may be lost, but that is really not lost, and that is very much there. And to be able to position that very clearly, I really wanted the queer to be a mode of opaque alliance, an alliance of thoughts that stand together. I sometimes think that, of course, this is a quite, let's say, conflicting idea that I'm still working with in my mind. What if we create another model of queer theory, feminism, and Marxism together, with balancing each other in certain politics? How would it happen? How would it help us? So it is much more kind of related with that. And of course, I think Jose Munoz, when he wrote the queer as a future potential, he was very clear about that opaque potential as well. And I think when we are speaking about these artistic positions, it is not only about a gathering of the queer artists, but it's a kind of a queer alliance, a queer political thought, a queer aesthetical model, a potential that can bring us like think and breathe together. That's what we need. We don't need really any more, you know, like these groupings and also killing the potentials of artists. So because as we have been rightfully speaking through this first day, an artist has multiple lives. It is a little bit like the Sphinx also. So you cannot, it's not only queer, it's not only Turkish, it's not only Sunni, it's not only this and it's not only that. There are like so many various bases that we should refer to when we are working together and in a very sensible way. I hope that answers.
We're open for questions.
Thank you, Ovul. Really enjoyed your presentation. I just thought I'd sort of to just scratch the surface of opaque and transparent surfaces, because I feel like
Can you hold the mic a little closer?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I feel like I often hear discussions around opacity and the necessity for it in a time when there's increased transparency due to information and an expectation of transparency, access, and those kind of things. But when looking at the way things are working around us, like I'll just bring two anecdotes. One, you have, like F-15 helmet visors, the helmet glass. When you're a pilot of those F-15 fighter jets,
Yeah.
you have a lot of information overlay happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
And a lot of people had to be trained to see through that.
Mhm.
And so there was an opacity of the screen that had to be made transparent. So because it was completely opaque. Or you take the stock exchange. You're there, you're looking at this massive churning of information, and all of this information really means something to some people.
Yeah.
They can decode it entirety. And some, it'll just look like abstract numbers. Which also then makes us probably rethink our relationship with representation and abstraction as we live it right now. And therefore also opacity and transparency. Because maybe we might need to find something else or some other way to describe what we're discussing here. And I'll just give an example of a friend. This is more a comment than a question. A friend who's based in Dubai, this artist who is of Chinese origin. His name is Lan Tianzi. And a couple of years ago, he made this project where he got the Sultan of Dubai's portraits made. And there's this official portrait of Sultan Sheikh Maktoum, if I'm not wrong. And there's an official portrait. And he got this made in Dafan village, which is one of the largest centers for reproduction of paintings of all all the great masters. Yeah. If you want a good reproduction of a Van Gogh or Vermeer, anyone, you go there.
Yeah, there
and
was
you
an
get
installation actually of an artist, Chinese artist in Documenta. He kind of collected all this reproduced.
I see. So this one, Lantian got the Sheikh's portraits made in exactly that state portrait scale, and had an entire exhibition of 15 of those portraits.
Okay.
As he's showing these paintings, everyone's sort of wondering, is this in praise of the Sultan, or is this sort of doing something else? The state, of course, did issue a notice and a mandate that none of these paintings can be sold. So there's something produced, that cannot be further transacted, but there's obviously a huge transaction of semantic or meaning. And I think it might be interesting for us to, this is just to think along with you, to think maybe slightly on an edge, on the peripheries of on the edges of transparency and opacity, where really the contours of these lie. Another small example, and with that, which is when you have stealth fighter jets, they're basically trying to stay off the radar. They're large opaque machineries flying up there, which are trying not to be captured and are not captured on another representational device, which is actually completely abstracted because it's just a green line moving on a circular screen marking a dot. So there might be something we might need to think about on this.
I mean, for me, okay, like let me think about this, because you're talking about different examples, and I don't think they're really on the same line, for me at least, in my thinking.
There was this, there is Delhi has a lot of this non-formal settlements. So their municipality does surveys. So there, and the surveys are basically kind of tied to an idea of entitlement. The entitlement could be fair price, food access to probably a future land in the city, periphery of the city. So in the survey, there is always this essay written by three friends. They argue that there is two words that people use in the neighborhood, which is called pardarshi, which would be translated as transparent, and pehre, what is it? Pardarshi, and that it would be kind of a negotiated illegibility.
Yep.
So what is the idea of the negotiated illegibility is that we stay in thresholds and gradations of illegibility. So say the person in the household may produce another family adjoined to it, saying that we stayed together, but they could create a wall saying that we are split to access two different cards, which may give them different entitlement. So this idea of there is no, so legibility is a kind of a threshold. So there are a series of negotiated illegibility by which we produce our encounter.
Yeah.
So and in this forensic logic, they have these thresholds of detectability, and they use it as a forensic, as a more juridical form. But I think the negotiated illegibility, that we are all illegible to each other with various degrees of thresholds, and those thresholds are continuously breached and reproduced. So that could be a more interesting possibility to get out of the binary trap, because the binary trap has a possibility of looping inside. Like you will be told that you are opaque, that's why you are illegitimate.
Well, I mean,
kind
I think, first of all, I mean, thank you for both of the points. But I honestly don't think that opaque is like, as I kind of refer to Glissant's thought, he is not really referring to opaque as like transparent opposition. Transparent opposition for him is obscure. So he talks about like obscurity, not opacity. So opacity is already like a new proposal that comes out of like the dichotomy machine for him. And that opacity is also very much against like some of like the let's say colonial, post-colonial thinking of the time that I was also referring like by Tayeb Saleh, like really like linking in the space, like staying in the space of the self and the other, and like dividing these boundaries like kind of very sharply. So that opacity for me is like what it is kind of goes beyond like to embrace. And of course, talking about like transparency and control, I'd like to remind that I didn't say that these are like acts of full transparency and control. I said the performance of transparency and control. This is very important because all of these codes, they don't actually do what they are supposed to do. I mean, as the Pilvi's project shows, that still needs a human supplement. The EI still needs a human supplement to be able to relate, to be able to like continue and function. And that human counterpart, that human prosthesis already like kind of brings that kind of, that space, that kind of in between, that's kind of an already like a shaded space. And of course, for me, it is very like clear what you say. I mean, I'd like to first refer that and then refer that comments, and thank you very much for both of them. I mean, Harun Faruqi has this really important project when he's talking. I mean, there's this, I think, 10-screen installation where he is talking about like the U.S. Marines fighting over in front of their computers, like they are accessing like a simulation of Baghdad, and they are hitting those, let's say, parts of Baghdad. They are simulated. They are sometimes, or most of the times, they are like shooting civilian spaces, and most of the time, like that war is like kind of so very like unclear. And I see this already like in the war machine, and of course of this, our relation of the image is very much driven by that war machine and that space that we put. You know, we cannot relate that there is this space that we put between those places, between those people and those communities, and then there's this kind of, you know, virtual landscape that performs something, but we don't know actually what it does. And this unclarities, I think, is very well elaborated in this work by Faruqi. I don't remember the title. Natasha, do you remember the title of this? It was also in Hamburger Bahnhof. War Games, yeah. That is about that, and it's and secondly, I also do think that we need to claim our politics back. I mean, we always need to reclaim of the politics back. And in terms of illegibility, I mean, yes, I to a certain degree, I agree with you about the illegibility, but still for me, the illegibility doesn't stand for the poetics. And this is a poetics that I still insist on working with. And there is, of course, one can argue that there's a certain illegibility involved in the poetics, but it's more than a kind of another mode of communication and relating. So I still think that we kind of keep falling back into that space when we are not really claiming that poetic space.
The Hindi word was pardedari, so I forgot.
Oh. There's a question up here.
Can I get a water? I'm completely dried. Here.
Hi.
Where? Hi. Hello.
I think there was something in the end that you were sharing about how queerness needs to exist with Marxism. But I think it's also a very geographical sort of a thing, because queerness, has gone beyond its understanding of it just within a sexuality framework. And queerness already embodies the idea of a resistance within it, because queerness is also anti-hegemony. And so Marxism, or a lot of resistance, so I just think that they both, Marxism can be queered, but queerness already embodies resistance, so I just want to understand.
Okay, this is already, as I would say that I was very clear about like this mode of resistance, queer as a mode of resistance, and that's already like as a kind of point of alliance, as this kind of political language, that political imagination that can be exercised through different means. And then for me, when I kind of come up with that kind of like that, let's say, more provocative, let's say, proposal, it's a question that is behind my mind. I think, yes, I agree that like queer is already like that kind of, it passed like a certain like place, but there are certain potentials like in these kind of grand narratives that can, I wouldn't say like amalgam, but like that can be like reconstructed, like a skeleton to be reconstructed in a way that would serve our thinking. But it may be called completely a different thing. And I think certain terms, of course, like they kind of are like so branded in our mind about what they are and what they aren't. We also, I believe, like with the proposal of like, let's say, the opaque, that also for me, aims to kind of push or like kind of cross across that. And I wouldn't agree that this is a kind of a geography. I mean, I'm Turkish. I come from the middle. I come from the middle of everything, I know that I look white right now, but I come from the middle of everything. It's all these kind of crossovers and all these kind of struggles and all these kind of struggles of modernity that is very particular. It's a kind of big crisis of modernity that right now pays back, in the form of Erdogan. So.
We're out of time, unfortunately, but we're actually going to take up a lot of more sort of dense discussion time tomorrow, which is also a way of luring you to return. But for now, we need to have a lunch break, and then we have 2 more presentations.
So, thank you.